Okay, so I have everything prepped up. So let's resume. We're at the Create Auto Scaling group page. And so what we want to do here is click on the Create Auto Scaling group, which I've already done and I've begun the configuration. So here we are on the step one, choosing the launch template. So I've named this Lab Auto Scaling group. And then I selected our launch template from the drop-down menu. Notice we have version control in here. So again, I can select a different version. If I did an update on the launch template, go in and choose the new version. It gives us a little overview by reading the launch template and giving us some details, telling us which one it's using, identifying the security group, instance type, etc. Now I can hit the next, or I could use this here. We're going to go ahead and click on next, and you'll see that I've already done some configurations here. So when we come down to the network section, you'll note that I've selected Lab VPC as indicated here. So Lab VPC has been selected. And then under the availability zones, I ensure that I selected the private subnet 1 and the private subnet 2. Now, if you take a look, as a reminder, in order to make these web instances more secure, we're going to take advantage of the fact that we have the application load balancer in the public subnet. So that's our front end. So now we can deploy the web instances in the private subnet. And if you recall, because we have the NAT gateway, if we do want to allow our web instances to pull updates externally, because they are EC2 instances, which means we manage the operating system updates, they'll be able to schedule the updates through the NAT gateway and be able to retrieve the updates and patches coming back from the external servers. So those are good to go. All right. So we have those set. So again, a reminder, it's the lab VPC, and we're identifying the public subnets in availability zone A and B. Let's move down to the next section. So at the bottom of the page, we can hit the next button. And then we want to ensure that we attach this to that existing load balancer that we created. And what's interesting about this is when we attach it to an existing load balancer, what we're really doing is attaching the auto scaling group to the target group that we created earlier. So we'll be able to select the target group from the drop-down menu, which I've already done. And if you don't see it in there because you just created, and sometimes you might have this open in advance, you can always use these refresh buttons, but it should show up right inside of there. So now we have that lab group, and then we can ignore this VPC lattice. Note that there are health checks, which are always enabled. So these health checks increase the availability by replacing our unhealthy instances. So when we have multiple health checks, all of those get evaluated, and at least if they detect at least one failure on one of those health checks, it's going to replace that failed instance. So that's the goal, is to monitor the health of our instances. And if for some reason one of our instances fails to respond, autoscale group will terminate the instance and deploy a new one in its place. And we can even control that, how that occurs. All right, so if we take a look, I believe that the last thing we wanted to do is enable the group metrics collection within CloudWatch. So this will capture metrics at 1 minute intervals, which allows autoscaling to react much more quickly to changing usage patterns. In production, what you typically do is you monitor what is the appropriate interval. And typically you can start with a 5 minute interval. And if that doesn't seem like it's reacting quickly enough, we can use this group metrics. We can enable it after the fact. All right, we'll go ahead and click next and move on to the next step. And so we take a look here. This is where we configure the group size and scaling. So we want the initial group size, setting the initial size of the auto scaling group to ensure that we have one instance per availability zone for this deployment. After creating the group, we can change the size to meet demand. We can either do that manually or we can use auto scaling below. So note that I've set the initial desired capacity at 2. So that will ensure that the auto scaling group automatically deploys to, and it always, because we've identified the two subnets, it will always spread them across the subnets. It won't group them all into one subnet. So this ensures that we have the high availability for our deployment. And then for scaling, we can have auto scaling resize our auto scaling group. Remember, we can do this manually. I can just go in there and click and say, I want more, or we can use something really kind of neat, a policy that would track the current traffic and the need to increase or not. So we take a look here. I've set the minimum desired capacity to match the desired. So typically you want to match those. I could set it lower, but I can't have our desired capacity set lower than the minimum. But minimum could actually be lower. You could say, oh, you know what? As long as I have one instance running, would be fine. I'm not concerned about high availability. I'm more concerned about keeping my costs down. Now, our max is a great way of actually capping how many instances. By setting max, we're saying no more than 6, even if traffic would warrant more than 6. Our budget limits us to 6 concurrent EC2 instances. Now, this is where I talked about how we can actually configure a policy. We're going to use a target tracking scaling policy. These are metric-based scaling policies, and it schedules scaling for auto scaling group. So I'll select the target tracking scaling policy, and we're going to choose a CloudWatch metric below and a target value. We're going to let the auto scaling or let the scaling policy adjust the desired capacity in proportion to the metric value. So we're going to name this scaling policy lab scaling policy. We're going to set the metric type to average CPU utilization. Note that we can set it based upon your CPU utilization, average network in bytes, average network out in bytes. Or we can do it as an application load balancer request count per target. So we can cap the number of requests per target so we don't overwhelm. Which one you select is really based upon doing some testing to determine which one makes the most sense. Typically for the labs, we're going to use the average CPU utilization, a little bit easier to use than the other ones. So we're setting that, and then what we want to do is set a target value of 60%, in fact. So this tells autoscaling to maintain an average CPU utilization across all the instances. We want to set it at 60. Auto scaling will automatically add or remove capacity, i.e. EC2 instances, as required to keep the metric at or close to that specified target value of 60% average. So it adjusts the fluctuations in the metric due to fluctuating load patterns. So it's going to be monitoring it and trying to keep it at 60%. We'll be testing that a little bit later. And then in terms of the instance maintenance policy, do note we're not making any adjustments. It's not using a policy, so we'll get mixed behavior. So any kind of rebalancing where new instances are brought online, the new instances will launch before terminating any others. And for all other kinds of events, instances terminate and launch at the same time. But you can change that. You can prioritize availability. You can control your costs. You can get flexibility. So we're going to leave all that alone. There's also an instance scale and protection, prevents newly launched instances from being terminated by a scaling activity. So we're going to leave that alone. So we're not enabling that. So again, if you take a look, just a few choices on here. I just want to review these again. We set desired to 2 and scaling minimum desired capacity to 2. We capped it at 6 for max, set a target tracking scaling policy that says we're going to monitor the average CPU utilization. We want to keep it at 60%. And then we'll come down here and hit next. And note that we can send notifications to an SNS topic, which means we can get an email message saying, hey, new EC2 instances have been scaled out. And that's kind of helpful. We can also send it to other places as well, those kind of messages. We'll hit next on that. I've already tagged it. So all my EC2 instances are going to be named lab instance. This will ensure that new instances are named lab instance. I'll hit the next button. I can review and see that there is the name of the template that's being used. Here are the availability zones. These are the private subnets. There's the load balancer I'm using. There's that target group identified. There's our group size. There's our scaling policy. Applying tags, create auto scaling group. Now, that's going to take a moment for it to launch new instances. I'll select that. And if I go to activity, we'll see that it's already launching 2 new EC2 instances. They're not yet in service. So the request has been made. Now, what's great is I could refresh this periodically and I can see their state. And it's going to take a moment for those to get launched. But I can continue to monitor it. Eventually, this is going to tell us that they're in service. All right, we'll go ahead and pause this for a moment and we'll wait till those go into service. Okay, so we're back and we can see down here under activity history that the launches were successful. And if we take a look over here at instance management, we can see the 2 EC2 instances that were deployed using that launch template, and they're both recognized as healthy. If I go over to monitoring and take a look at my auto scaling, you can see here that we've launched 2 instances. So that's our group minimum size, which hasn't changed. And then we can see that group service instances are now set at 2. And you can also look at EC2 CPU utilization. And I'm not sure there's much more on here, but you can take a look at all that. All right, that's it for auto scaling. When we come back, we're going to verify that the load balancing is working, and then we'll go from there. I'll see you on the next video.